Hey everybody, this is the second in a series of videos on these Osram throwers. If you saw my last video, you probably thought the Maxtoch X Pro here had the best throw, and then these two in the back were the worst, and then these were somewhere in the middle. Now, I would say that's true, but I would actually recommend this Fireflies T9r, and I'd like to explain. Now first off, don't worry, the video is dark for a reason, because I want to show off the beam quality of these lights, starting with the Noctigon K1. You're probably most familiar with the K1 series just because they're pretty popular on this forum, but you can also see that it's pretty justified. The beam quality here, aside from this ring around the hotspot, is near perfect, and that's pretty impressive considering this is a used light with a gash right here. You would expect it to be off-center. The other advantage is this backlit RGB switch, which means you can tell how much battery you have without having to do a battery check. This is especially useful here on this SBT 90.2 version. I'll double click it and you can see that you can see the voltage sag happening in real time. This is really useful in case you've put in a bad cell. This will let you know about it pretty quickly. The other thing I want to say about this SBT 90.2 version is that it has similarly good beam quality. You can see a pinwheeling effect, I guess because of the large emitter around the hotspot, but this isn't something you see in real use. So overall, I'd say these two K1s are really solid in terms of their beam quality. However, their big weakness in my mind is their balance. If I try to hold the light, just contacting the button here, you'll notice that, I guess you can't see on camera, but it kind of falls forward. And this is a problem. I'd say it has the worst balance of all these lights here. It's not terrible. You can work around it by moving your finger between the reflector and this heatsink area. But overall, I'd say this does tire out the hand slightly. One thing I also wanted to mention is the heat management. I'd say this W2.2 model is acceptable because it sustains around 40% of its output. But this SBT 90.2 version I would not recommend. It's expensive, and for the money, you only get 20% relative output when the thing heats up. In fact, if I double click and hold the momentary turbo on this light, oh my god, this is candle mode. There we go. I can only hold this in unregulated, or rather no step down, momentary turbo for about a minute. Even as I'm holding it here just these few seconds, I can feel the light heating up. This is going to be true of most small size SBT 90.2 lights, so I'd suggest looking for a bigger host to properly drive and focus this emitter. Now, speaking of balance, I also wanted to mention this Convoy L21A. This is a really tempting option just because it's pretty inexpensive. You can get this for around $45 even after the price hike. But there's also the L21B, which is a lot lighter. You'll notice around the hotspot there are some rings, but they aren't really bad, and I don't really see them in real use. When I spin the emitter, you can see that it's pretty well centered as well, which is pretty good for this sort of light. I have heard that these aren't very well focused, but it's not something I've noticed. I'm sure I could take it apart and shim it to focus it better. But the most important thing is that its heat management is around 50%. However, it does get hotter than these two lights when it's sustaining at 50%. I'd say its interface is pretty good, but the trade-off of having your hand constantly on the tail switch is that this heaviest of all these lights, I guess second to the X Pro, is that you have to let your wrist bear the weight of the head in this suboptimal position. If you hold the light by its balance point after you set the output, then it's fine. It actually balances perfectly around the heatsink area. But if you want to have access to your modes, I would say that this gets even more tiring than the K1. The other thing I wanted to mention about the modes is that it sometimes forgets them. Just twice today already, I had to reset the mode groups. I have no idea why, but it's not really that much of an issue. So overall, I'd say this thing, while being half the price of, say, this X Pro or this SBT 90.2 K1, I would say if you want this type of light, go for the L21B. It'll probably sustain less, around 30%, but because you're holding it by the tail, it'll be about as heavy as this Fireflies, and it will be a lot better balanced. So overall, I'd say the K1s are good if you like the RGB switch. The L21B is good if you like a cheaper price, and emitter options like, I guess, GTFC40. Which brings us, I guess, to this Maxtoch X Pro. Now, it undoubtedly has the best throw. And it does that with pretty decent beam quality, just a slight ring around the hotspot. But the interface is a real problem. As I hold it, the balance is pretty good. I would say it's actually better than the K1 despite being similarly shaped and despite being heavier. The heat management is really good, sustaining around 70%. But the first thing is that it has this forward clicky mechanical tail switch. And that means you can do signaling and momentary output, but once you've clicked it in, I'm going to go ahead and on camera try and ramp this. That might have not looked terrible on camera, but it looks terrible in real life. As I'm holding it, the very top of the ramp is really, really slow, and the very bottom of the ramp is incredibly fast. If you measure with a lux meter, it takes less than half a second for this thing to ramp up to around half its output, and that is completely unacceptable. This E-switch interface is so bad that it's actually worse than just going low, medium, high, because you can't reliably hit medium on this light. So, however, I did mention that this thing sustains around 70%, and it gets even less hot than this L21A, about similarly hot as these K1s. That's really good. So maybe you don't have to care about the interface problems because you just use it on turbo all the time. So yeah, I guess get the Maxtoch X Pro if you can get it on sale like I did for $125. It's not worth it for $165. Yeah, so I think that's where I'll leave it. The last light I want to mention is this Fireflies T9r. First thing I want to mention here is the beam quality. You can see a lot of ring artifacts in the mid-zone of the beam. That's pretty unacceptable for this price. The thing retails for around $100 as opposed to $90 for the K1. And while the hotspot appears good for a moment, I'm going to go ahead and try and pull out and spin the emitter to show you. Here, I'm going to actually put it on low. You can see that the spill is spinning around, which means that this emitter is way off center. And unlike the other lights, this is something you notice in real use. You can spin the light in your hands and notice the spill going in weird directions. Or I should say that's the corona, not the spill. Whew. So why do I recommend this light then over all the others? I'd say it's because everything else is better. The balance. While it seems rear heavy as I hold it in the hand, when I put my hand directly on the button, it's perfect, and that's the only light that I can say this about. The other thing is heat management. Even though this thing is the lightest of the bunch at around 300 grams, it manages to sustain 60% with this Osram W1 emitter, which is very impressive. In fact, if you bring this up to 55 degrees, which burned me, unlike the K1 did at 55 degrees, it'll sustain 70%. So I guess if you have gloves, you can basically run this thing uninterrupted. And it has the same Anduril interface that the two K1s have. Overall, I'd say this K1, or rather this T9R, is the best of the bunch. However, there is an asterisk. Now, currently Fireflies is first out of stock on these buck drivers. So there aren't that many of these T9Rs left before they get restocked. And the chip shortage means that won't happen for a while. But the other big issue is quality control. I already mentioned the off-center emitter, but some folks are getting Fireflies lights with tail cap threads that are so poorly cut that they seize. And that is, really terrible. Like, if this Convoy light can be sold anywhere from $40 to $50, sometimes $30, how the heck does something like this have seized tail cap threads caused by like a dull lathe cutter? That's absolutely ridiculous. So, if you get a good one, or if you buy from someone like Jackson Lee, if he still stocks these lights, you'll probably get a good one. But if you're buying direct, you may run into issues of long delivery times or bad customer service in the event that you get a lemon. Yeah, that's not a great note to end on. All right, let's wrap this up. Where does that leave us with these Osram throwers? These Noctigon K1s have earned the reputation. They have good beam quality and decent thermal sustain. If you don't care about the balance and really value the RGB switch, go for them. If you want to go even cheaper, the Convoy lights, especially the L21B, would be my recommendation. And if you can deal with the balance, you can get more sustain by going with the L21A. In fact, there is an SFT40 emitter that is getting really popular. You essentially sacrifice candela relative to the W2. This Maxtoch light is the best of the bunch in terms of throw, but I think its E-switch interface is terrible. If you go for the longer version of the light, there's just a low, medium, high interface like on this Convoy, and maybe that'll work better. but overall, I'd say Maxtoch is overpriced when it's not on sale, and the interface is really letting it down. Finally, this T9r. If you get a good one, you'll get a light that is actually the least heavy of the bunch, while sustaining similarly, and has a form that lends itself well to packing. I really think that's great. A light that you leave at home, even if it throws well, is kind of useless. Overall, I'd recommend the T9r out of all of these.